Y'all, right on. Okay, so last week we are starting on James chapter 2, and the word that I picked for James chapter 2, verses 1 through 13 in this section is called partiality. It was probably the best word I could think of, and it kind of comes right out of Scripture. So that was kind of, I don't need to rethink it all. God set that up for us pretty easy. So that was kind of nice. We talked about verse 1, my brethren, do not hold the faith of your Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory, with partiality. That concept is what we're going to talk about. In James 2, he says, my brethren. So once again, he's reiterating that he's talking to other believers. He's not just, we know at the beginning that he said, hey, I'm a Jew and I'm writing to other Jews. But he also said, hey, I'm a believer writing to other believers. And that's the connect point that we as individuals can make as well, because we are believers also. And he just got done in chapter 1 talking about temptations, and he talks about trials and how to handle those things. Now that we know how to handle those things and we can actually move forward in the strength of our faith, we now need to understand that that faith needs to be open and honest to all people. That is the concept. And that's where we get this word partiality. The word partiality, as I told you last time, means receiving the face, right? Receiving the face. So it's basically kind of a weird way of saying like taking things at face value. Okay, taking things at face value. So if you look at somebody and you think of somebody in a specific way, maybe it's a social convention, or maybe it's the way the world dictates the way we look at different people in different situations. That is a partiality. It's a judgment made based off of the paradigm of your life. All the things that you've done, all the knowledge that you have, all the different experiences that you have makes up the paradigm of your life. When you come in contact with somebody, whether we want to or not, it's kind of a human nature thing to have partiality. And now that we got a chance to talk about that in verse 1, verses 2 through 4, which is what we're going to look at today, James gives us a really good example of what that looks like. All right? A really good example of what that looks like. So, oh, hi. Yeah, sorry. You're annexed to the back. So what we're going to look at is we're going to look at what that kind of looks like, what that partiality looks like. And James is fantastic at throwing out this really good illustration. And as he did with some of the other stuff that he talked about in chapter 1, we have to remember the cultural difference between what he talks about and what we're looking at. Because, as I said, he's one believer talking to other believers, but he is a Jew writing to other Jewish believers. So when he references Jewish stuff, we don't see it because we're not Jewish. You know what I mean? We're not a first century Jew looking at this and reading it and knowing exactly what it means. Once again, it's just kind of cultural, like if one person from Australia was talking to another person from Australia and they were referring to, going on a walkabout or something like that, they would know what that meant with each other. We wouldn't necessarily understand that because that's not our culture, right? But they would understand those things. And if they make reference to those things, there's kind of a norm of understanding there. This section between 2 and 4 is that cultural connection as one Jew would have with another Jew. And since we are not Jews, then it lands to me to try and explain that to you so that you would understand that connection, so that you would appreciate what James is saying to these believers who are also Jews, because they would have got it right away. Because as you look at this illustration on the surface, makes perfect sense, and it would help you to understand the danger of partiality. You know what I mean? But to understand it deeper, we need to understand what is looked at here. So 2 through 4, this is what it says, and then we'll go back and kind of look at it a little a little bit more. It says, for if there should come into your assembly a man with gold rings and fine apparel, and there should also come a poor man in filthy clothes, and you pay attention to the one wearing the fine clothes, and say to him, you sit here in a good place, and say to the poor man, you sit there, or sit here at the footstool. Have you not shown partiality among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Now, if you just take this on the surface, it makes perfect sense. You know what I mean? If we're talking about partiality and you see one guy that obviously seems to be rich and another guy that obviously seems to be impoverished, if you see those two and you make a judgment call, on the surface, it fits right in. But it actually has a more richer, deeper kind of an understanding because, once again, culturally speaking, it has a greater level of separation in that partiality. Let me explain that. So we go into verse 2. It says, if there should come into your assembly. That word assembly is the key. This is, in that word assembly, is what starts us down the path of understanding how deep this meaning is culturally from one Jew to another. Okay? The word assembly. Now, here at the church, in our church, we meet together as Christians and believers and stuff like that. And if we were going to use a Greek word for that, it would be ekklesia. It would be church. Maybe you've heard that word before or something like that, or maybe some pastor's thrown it out there to you. Ekklesia, it means church. It's the local assembly, right? But that's not this word. This word assembly is actually synagoge, which is where we get our English word for synagogue. Okay? Synagogue. Now, it makes perfect sense that he would be saying the word synagogue or be talking about a synagogue. Why? Because he's a Jewish guy talking to other Jews, right? So if he said, if somebody came into your synagogue and one guy looked rich and one guy looked poor, right? So that kind of takes it to a different level, culturally speaking. And I want you to understand that because when we read it as 21st century Gentiles, it makes sense to us. It does, right? But in the first century, as one Jew talking to another Jew, they would start painting a picture in their head, all right? And as they would paint a picture in their head, it becomes a richer illustration. And I want to paint that picture for you today. So here, if we're looking at this, James' illustration talks about these two men coming into a synagogue. It sounds like some kind of joke. Two guys walking to a synagogue. But it's not quite that. Two guys walking to a bar. They both said, ouch. So one is dressed all to the nines, man. He's got rings. He's got, the good clothes and stuff like that. Here it says he's gold rings and fine apparel is what it says. Now, back in the Jewish culture, back in the day, in the first century, that was a big status thing. And I think that's a status thing now sometimes, but more so back then. Back in those days, identity was such a big deal. Like identity was such a huge thing, a huge part of culture back then, especially among the Jews, right? So if a guy was wearing gold rings, that was that signified his level of wealth. Okay? It was just a thing that they did back then. If you wore lots of rings and jewelry and stuff like that, it signified your level of wealth. And if you had really cool adorned apparel, especially things like purple, the color purple back then was like a big deal because purple was a hard colored dye to come by. You really had to, there was two different kinds of purple dye that you could get. One was kind of cheaper than the other one, but it didn't last as long. The other one was harder to get. And anyway, that's not important. But when you wore apparel, it showed your standing amongst people. Okay? So if you had jewelry and all that kind of stuff, it showed a level of wealth. And if you had really cool apparel, like cool robes and things like that, it showed your status amongst the social people. It's a social standing. So if you combine those two together, a guy with a high social standing and he was adorned with lots of gold and stuff like that, this is a guy that is an influential guy. He is an influential guy amongst the people. He's obviously rich. He obviously has influence. He's the kind of guy that you want to have as your friend. You know what I mean? You ever have those dreams that you're walking along and Elon Musk is walking across the street and you like save him from a car running him over, and you're thinking, oh man, this is the guy I want, to owe me something. You know what I mean? That's the kind of thing that we're talking about here. Having him as a friend could change things, could open doors for you. That's what this guy is all about, right? He's very influential. He's obviously very wealthy. That's the picture that they would see back then, okay? Back in the first century, that was a big thing. Here in the 21st century, it still makes sense to us that the guy is obviously wealthy, right? Expensive jewelry, good fabrics and silks and things like that. These garments, showed his influence. Now, he wrote this story kind of in reverse, because when he walks into the synagogue judges this guy. But this guy, who is an influential man and obviously rich, he's usually a guy that is somebody who judges other people. Like, because of his influence, he's somebody that kind of, because of his status, social status, he would be the guy that people would bring before him and ask, hey, what do you think of this guy? You know what I mean? It's almost like today, if you were to look at it in the 21st century, if you're going to open a business, you wouldn't ask a kid that has a paper route. You would ask a guy who owns like 3, 4, 5 businesses and is successful. You know what I'm saying? How'd you do this? How'd you get this done? Versus, a little kid with paper route. I don't know. I signed up for it and I ride my bike. You know what I mean? It's a different status thing, right? So here is that kind of concept, and it's just kind of interesting and what it's not saying, but culturally that's what it would be. So here we got this guy, super rich, comes into the synagogue, right? Then right next to him is another guy, and that's where the second guy is introduced, right? This guy is poor, and if very wealthy, jewels and stuff, and very, hotsy-dotsy, adorned clothes shows status and wealth, this guy obviously shows the exact same thing, but in the other extreme. These obviously are two guys of very different extremes, right? It says here that a poor man with filthy clothes, okay? So back in the day, sometimes clothes were like one of your biggest assets that you would have, all right? Because of the, social status, people would go buy very rich, cloths and things like that were dyed in different ways and things like that. Sometimes your clothes, believe it or not, were like one of the biggest assets that you had, right? You didn't have a big old house like we do that's stuffed full of things. You don't think you have a lot of stuff in your house. Try and move. Okay? Try and move. And you start packing stuff up and you're like, oh my gosh, like, why are we keeping this? Why do we have that? It's because it's just how we are. Back in the day, they didn't have big old honking houses like that where they had stuff stored in the attic for years on end. They would have things, of course, in their houses and things like that. But sometimes their clothes were some of the biggest things that they had. This guy, he basically only had the clothes he had on and they were filthy, right? So this sets the scene for what we're looking at, all right? And then he walks into the synagogue. And the first person he meets is probably the usher. Just like we would do here. You come in through the front door and Donald or Barry or somebody comes up and gives you a hug or shakes your hand, gives you a bulletin, that type of thing. Same thing would happen in the synagogue. You come into the synagogue and somebody would greet you there, right? And as these two men come in, the usher comes down and meets them. And he has a split-second decision to make in what he's going to do. Okay? And what is he going to do? That's the question, right? And the question that's hanging is partiality. Okay? The question that's hanging is partiality. So these two guys walk in. What is this usher going to do? Well, if I was going to try and get pictures in here, and I didn't want to set up like a TV and stuff like that. I've been to a lot of these synagogues and things like that in Israel and Jerusalem and all these kinds of things. But I figured I would draw them for you because I know how much you guys really love me writing things. Drawing is just going to take it to a whole nother level. So usually when you walk into a synagogue, okay, you would have, you'd come in through the door, and along the sides here, we'll talk about those. But down the middle, there's usually the pulpit that they would have, and back here was kind of like a table, kind of a tabernacle kind of table thing. And then, well, they weren't really seats. There were places where people would come and kneel, or seats or whatever that would come by. Now, when you come in the door, all right, the best seats in the house, like the tabernacle is basically where the scrolls were kept, where the law is written on and stuff like that. So the pastor or the preacher or the reverend would come. He'd grab a couple of these scrolls, he'd take them out and start reading them to people. So that's where that was. So here at the pulpit, the closer you are to the show was the best seats in the house. All right, best seats in the house. If you go into one of these synagogues, these areas along the side were usually balconies. Sometimes they were separated onto the side, and there were kind of like fences, like you would see on your porch, kind of fences and things like that, or it would be a balcony. That's where all the women and children sat. Okay, the men would not sit there. The men were taken down to the floor and be close to the action. The women and children were always sat up in the balconies off to the side. And the closer you are to the pulpit, the greater it is for you to be able to hear and to be able to experience whatever is going on there, right? So as you're looking at that scenario, all right, two guys come in. Usher's looks at the two, has to make a split-second decision. What does he do? Well, it tells us. Here it says in verse 3, and you pay attention to the one wearing the fine clothes and say to him, you sit here in the good place. Here, let's get you right up front, man. Let's get you right in the action. Let's get you where the cool seats are, right? Front row seat at the Lakers game or whatever, or front, 50-yard line at the Alabama game. Let's get you right where you need to be. Let's get you right in the action, man. And that's the first thing that he does. Why? Because he gravitates to the guy who is aesthetically pleasing, right? Then what happens to the next guy? Then, if we look at it again, if I can find verse 3, because I just lost it, pay attention to the fine clothes and say to him, here, sit here. And then the next guy, what is the next guy? Next guy didn't even really get a seat. And he says to the poor man, you stand there. He didn't even get a seat. You stand over there. Or sit here at my footstool. That word footstool, that's a really good descriptive word for us to be able to understand what we're talking about here. All right? That Greek word means under the foot of a conqueror. It was a word that was used a lot of times when somebody would win a battle and they would take prisoners. Those prisoners would be basically footstool people under the feet of a conqueror. And it gives the idea of putting your foot on the neck of somebody that you've just, taken over. You know what I mean? That's what that Greek word means. Yeah.
The NIV says, sit here at my feet.
Yeah, at my feet. That's what it is. It's the concept of like having your foot on someone's neck that you've just kept down. Okay? So he says, stand over there or sit beneath me. Okay? Sit beneath me. All right? So here, this guy doesn't even get a good seat. He doesn't even get a seat. He stand out of the way or sit yourself underneath me because you're beneath me. That's the split second decision that this guy gets to make. Yeah, Mom.
So who's this guy that's making all the decisions?
Well, we don't know, but we assume that it's some kind of synagogue temple attendant, like an usher or something like that, or maybe one of the lower priests, not the main priest, but the lower priests would come out and greet the people and sit them where they needed to go, or yeah, an elder or a deacon, something equivalent to that today for us in the 21st century.
You know, it's interesting reading this. I remember when I was a teenager, I went to kind of a major church here in Mobile.
Mm-hmm.
Say it, but and we call it big church. And we had a bus ministry.
Mm-hmm.
And as teenagers, they would allow us to go to the sanctuary for a main service.
Mm-hmm.
And the church was on TV.
Ah.
Okay. Well, they wouldn't let the bus ministry sit down in the box.
Because they'd be seen on TV.
We were in blue jeans, tennis shoes,
Yeah.
t-shirts, or whatever. They made us sit up in the balcony.
Right.
And they made sure people in their suits and ties would sit on the front rows.
Mm-hmm.
So I just find this interesting that, I mean, it's very, it's not hard to understand what these verses say.
No, not at all.
A church do that. That's pretty, it's kind of upsetting, even though it was 40 years ago, but still, you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, and that's the thing is, if you go into these, and like I said, I've been into several of these things, and they're all different. Some of them have fenced in areas that are way off to the side. And if you technically, if you look at the structure of a lot of these places, in between like the main area and the balconies or the sitting areas were usually support pillars that would be, you ever seen that Farmers commercial where that guy is going to a football game and he bought the cheap seats and he goes and he sits down and he's right in front of that pillar? You ever seen that commercial where the dude's sitting right in front of that pillar? And then the Farmers guy goes, "Oh, you got a bad deal on the cheap seats, right?" And the guys literally can't see anything because the pillar's right in his way. Well, technically, a lot of those places are built that way. They have these wonderful structures and they have these wonderful pillars and everything, and they're decorative and they keep the roof up, of course. But if you're sitting off to the side here, you could be sitting behind one of those pillars, so you don't even necessarily get to see the action. You just kind of see. So that's where, sadly, the women and the children sat. But this guy doesn't even get one of them seats. He didn't even get that seat. He's like, stand over here. Like, just stand over here and get out of the way. Okay? Or you can just sit, underneath my feet and because you're beneath me. All right? That visual, all right, is once again something that transcends things that go on, right? Oh, yeah. So anyway, what we see is something that transcends thousands of years, is that when we read this stuff, some people in the Bible, or some people in the 21st century have the nerve to say, well, the Bible is something that was written thousands of years ago, and how is it applicable to me too? How is it not? Like, I wish as a people, we were smarter. I grew up watching stuff like Star Trek. Well, I was going to say not because I'm a nerd, but that's not true. But the premise of Star Trek is that they've evolved beyond, in the 24th, 26th century, whatever. They've evolved beyond the concept of exchanging money. They just work together, collaborate together, build ships to travel out into space, to experience new things and all this kind of stuff. They transcend beyond that. I could never see from the first century to the 21st century, 20 centuries later, we're doing the exact same thing that we did thousands of years ago. I just don't see how we're going to be able to get over that. You know what I'm saying?
You kind of imagine that the reason they would
treat these people that way. This guy that's dressed to the nines,
Mm.
he's got more money to support us.
And that is the next part of the verse. So if you continue to read the verse and you continue to read the section in verse 4, it says, "Have you not shown partiality among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts?" What kind of evil thought? Well, on the surface, what evil thought are you thinking? Money? You know what? Maybe the attendant is thinking to himself something selfish or personal. Maybe he's thinking, well, if I sit this guy in a good spot, maybe he'll give me a tip or something like that, right? Or maybe it's
Maybe he'll support my business.
exactly. Maybe he'll support me, or he'll owe me, or he'll recognize me, or maybe he's looking for something quote unquote nobler. Maybe if I sit him in a good spot, he'll give a good donation to the church or to the synagogue, and then we can do all those kinds of things and whatnot. All those thoughts are self-motivated, right? They're showing partiality. They're showing that you're looking at somebody at face value and judging them and then moving on. Now, we look at this situation and we look at this in the 21st century, we look at the situation and go, that is just sick and wrong. That's stupid. That's awful. And yet, that's our, as human nature's go-to move, is to do that. Okay? I can tell you this because I don't work in that business anymore, but I used to manage restaurants for almost 25 years. I'd hire somebody. I'd be interviewing somebody as a server. And the server is my frontline guy. The guy who comes to the table, the first person that you see is the hostess. And then the hostess will take you to the table. And then the server is like the front guy, a frontline person. They don't know who's cooking in the back. You don't know, when you go out to eat, you don't know who's cooking in the back. You don't know how many people are cooking in the back. You don't never see that. Who you see is your server. And that server is somebody who helps you, guides you through the menu, takes care of you while you're there, that whole business. So he's the one, the upfront person that you see all the time. So when I would hire a server, and this is terrible, but when I'd hire a server, I'd look at that person and I would, in my mind, say, are you aesthetically pleasing enough to represent my store?
No.
Yeah.
I have been in a lot of stores and I would say no.
Yeah, I mean, nowadays we try not to be partial, and I think that's awesome. I think that's super awesome. But to me, I'm running a $10 million a year business, all right? And I have people I have to answer to. If I'm short on my P&L by 1%, 1%, 1 week, I'm down 1%. I got to eat dirt for that week because I was short $200 somewhere, or my waste was, up 1% or 0.5%. And I had to account for $200. $200, get off me. All right. But that's how the big businesses do it. So I would look at this and go, oh my word, if you had tattoos down your arm and they couldn't be covered by a shirt, like our uniform shirt that was short sleeve, if you had tattoos down your arm, I wouldn't hire you. I don't care how much experience you had. That's awful. So terrible. But I'm guilty. I was that guy. I'm not that guy anymore. Thank goodness. I hated that job. I hated all those jobs. But that's what the world looks at. That's what the 21st century people look like. And that's what the first century people looked at too. And we're not talking about going to the restaurant. This is talking about going to a synagogue where people go to worship. It shouldn't matter if you walk through my door wearing shorts and a flip-flops or wearing a three-piece suit. Because to me, I don't care. To me, I'm going to preach to you no matter what. Because you need Jesus, and I know you need Jesus, and I need to tell you about Jesus. That's my job. But I need to make sure that we all understand that too. And that's what James is doing. Partiality. If you take that scenario and you look at that and go, well, you got this guy and this guy. We all do it, man. You need help at Home Depot and you see this guy who looks like he's older and he looks like he's, got that thick leathery skin, like he's been out on, roofing all day and stuff like that. I want to ask that guy about my toilet. You know what I mean? That's the guy I want to ask. Or you've got this young girl who's over there and she's over there stocking shelves and stuff. And you go, she didn't know jack about my toilet. She didn't know nothing about my toilet. Well, you know what? She could be his boss. And I didn't know that. Because why? Because of that.
Where I work, being an older guy,
Mhm.
big bearded guy, and when we got customers coming in, a lot of times when you stand at the register and the team lead, who's 20, 30 years younger than me,
Mhm.
sitting there, and another team member, I find that the customers come in, they'll go directly to me
Mhm.
to ask questions
Mhm.
because
Because of the nature. of
Yeah,
the business.
because the nature of the business. And that's the social convention, right? That's just what you do. And that is what James is here talking about. He's talking about something simple, partiality. He's using the context of what he's talking about is Jewish in nature because he's painting this picture of a synagogue that people would understand. But even on the surface of us reading it, we can understand the kind of prejudice that's going on there. And it couldn't be clearer. I don't see how it could be clearer that James is saying that kind of prejudice is sin. It's bad. It's wrong. Because, like I said before last week, if we were all judged on what we were back in the day, none of us would qualify for anything, right? Anywho, all right, let's be done because we are out of time. We're 1 minute over. All right. So let's pray and we'll be done. All right. Dear Lord, thank you so much for this chance that we have to open our hearts and open our minds. Dear Lord, as we look at this situation and we read James's words, we are compelled to agree. And yet, as we live out our life here on earth, prejudice and partiality still exists. And it still exists within us. Dear Lord, I would ask that you would continue to help us, to guide us, to direct us, to challenge us, to open our hearts and minds as we look at people, especially during this holiday season. During this holiday season, it should be the easiest time of the year to tell people about Jesus and to show people about your Son and how wonderful the gift is that you gave us through him. This should be the easiest time. And yet we could disqualify ourselves from being able to share that message because of partiality. Dear Lord, challenge us, stir us to the very core, help us to understand who we are and who we are in you. And that's all that matters. Thank you so much, dear Lord, for this time that we have this and help these words just kind of resonate with us. We ask it in Jesus' precious name. Amen.